let me welcome you to another one of our free 45-minute webinars. This one is on somebody who I think many people are familiar with, and a text that often gets taught and then looked at pretty closely and then put down as we move on to so many other things, but it's really a wonderful, short philosophical dialogue, very rich, Plato's Symposium. And I wanted to look at the themes not only of love and sex in terms of desire and sexuality and gender, but also some of the implications for politics in this work that I think you have to call out a bit, and we'll probably talk quite a bit about this in the Q&A section. So I'm Greg Sadler. Those of you who know me, this is all old hat to you. For any of you who don't, I'm the president of ReasonIO, so I'm a philosopher, you could say, in private practice. That's our company through which we offer these sorts of webinars and online seminars and tutorials and all sorts of other stuff that I can tell you about later. I'm an online educator on figures in philosophy. I've actually taught Plato's Symposium not only in face-to-face classes, but several times in online classes as well that I've designed. And I've been teaching Plato's works in particular for about 20 years. He's kind of a staple figure of mine, and so I'm very happy to be talking about one of the texts that I actually like the best, which is the Symposium. So what I thought we would do in this webinar is we'll do a very, very brief introduction. And again, anything is fair game in the Q&A. So if there's anything that you want to know more about, just ask about it. Make a note for yourself. The topics that we're going to discuss in this fairly short, compressed format are the structure and themes of Plato's Symposium. And then we're not going to look at all of the speeches. I wanted to look at three sections in particular. The very early section with Phaedrus and Pausanias' speeches, Aristophanes' very famous speech about us seeking our other half, and then finally the wise woman Diotima's discourse. And then we've got 20 minutes reserved for Q&A and discussion. And sometimes we go a little bit over in that, which is quite all right. So think about some key questions that come up for us. These are really existential questions, meaning that in the course of human existence, these pose themselves to us, and we get into lots of discussions, and we're given answers that may not always be the best answers. So one of the key questions is, well, what is love? And then we have another set of questions. Is it something good or something bad? Some people think that love is actually something we want to avoid. Is love connected with sexual desire, and how is it connected? Is it the same thing? Is it something different? Does it overlap? And I should point out, too, that here in the Symposium, the word that Plato is most often using is eros, which we often associate just with sexual desire, but it had a broader meaning not only for the ancient Greeks, but also for Plato. Another question, does love or sexuality need to be limited in some way or controlled or directed? Or is it a force that can cause all sorts of problems for us? And if it is, then how do we do that? And, do either of these, love or sexuality, sexual desire, have anything to do with the political community? Or is it something where we should say, well, that's private life, and then we have political life, and they're not really connected with each other? So Plato discusses these, really never showing his own hand until the end with the speech of Diotima, by placing a lot of speeches in the mouths of people in the dramatic context of a symposium, a drinking party. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. You see a nice little depiction here of people laying down on these couches to drink and enjoy themselves. So let's talk about the first topic. What is this symposium business? It's a really weird drinking party, and I've done some talking about this in other places in videos that I can give you as a resource if you're interested. It's a drinking party where instead of drinking, they talk instead, and they're going to give speeches in praise of love. And so we want to look at those speeches and the order of them. So let's talk about symposia in general. So a symposium means coming together to drink. It's coming from the verb for drink, and then the sum that is a prefix meaning together or with. And these were quite common in ancient Greece. More of an upper class sort of thing, in part because you had to have a significant outlay for the wine, and there would be entertainment and food. As a matter of fact, they send away the entertainers in this case. There's a flute girl who's supposed to play, and the reason why, according to Plato, they decide not to drink very heavily, although if you read all the way to the end, they're all drinking by the end. If you read that, you're going to find that it's because they're hungover, at least some of them, from the celebration from the night before. Looks like we may have some mic issues going on. Hopefully everybody is hearing me well. So what they decide to do instead of doing heavy drinking, and they do this on their doctor's orders. Eryximachus is a medical professional who is involved in this decision, is they're going to give speeches, and they're going to give speeches about something that has not been eulogized up until this time, and that is love, the great God, the force that moves us, this thing that we all have to take account of at one time or another. They're celebrating Agathon's, he's the host, his victory in the recent tragic competition. He's won a prize, and you'll see why if you read his section. He's actually quite a great. So each of these speeches is given in praise of love, and it's interesting because they're supposed to be praising this great God who is worshipped in various ways, who's celebrated, and each of them is complaining, if you read the things, about the others not actually getting around to telling us what love is, that they're flattering love, but not actually praising love. Each of the participants in this is giving a speech praising love. Now, some of these people are actually lovers, and this is an issue we can talk about in the Q&A. In the Symposium, you're going to see a lot of references to male-male relationships, and they're quite often one that involves an age and, to some respect, a power imbalance. So Pausanias is an older man who is the lover of Agathon, who is this beautiful, brilliant youth who writes poetry, and Pausanias is an older legal expert of some sort. Eryximachus is this physician, and Phaedrus is another young, beautiful man as well. Each of the speeches that we see here, and Plato actually tells us, well, these aren't all of the speeches, and these aren't exactly what they said, but these are what I remember from the time. He's putting this in the mouth of another character. Each of them expresses a certain point of view. So Eryximachus, for example, looks at things the way not just a medical doctor, but somebody who's devoted to natural science would do it. Aristophanes tells us a crazy comedic story. Socrates, in his term, is going to engage in dialectic. Agathon is going to engage in rhetoric. And each of the speeches addresses one or more that came before them as well. Here's the order of the speeches as we have them, if you haven't read the text. First, this guy Phaedrus gives a nice little speech. It's fairly short, and it's rather conventional. And then Pausanias follows up and gives a much more involved speech that has to do, in large part, with moral philosophy and with legal issues. Eryximachus gives a really interesting, although rather dry speech. If you look at the way everything is framed, it's very scientific. Aristophanes then, who is supposed to speak right after Pausanias, but who swapped places with Eryximachus, is going to give his speech, and it's, like I said, this wild story about what the gods did to us and why everything is the way it is in terms of love. And then we have a bit of a change. Well, we have Agathon's speech. I had to put in there as well. But then we have Socrates' speech. And Socrates is going to do something a little bit strange. He's not going to speak on his own behalf. He's going to attribute what he has to say to this wise woman, Diotima. And so we're going to take a look at what she has to say. And then it comes to a comic conclusion with this guy, Alcibiades, who is supposed to be Socrates' lover, but is really in love with Socrates. And he's totally drunk. He's sort of the golden boy of Athens at the time. This is before his fall from grace for betraying his country and moral perfidy and all sorts of things like that. And he is going to give this wild speech that turns it into back into a drinking party. Now, we want to look at Phaedrus's and Pausanias' speeches, in part because they have to tell us something about politics and how it might be connected with love. And one of the questions we want to keep in mind is, do they actually teach us what love is? This is going to be a complaint a little bit later on. So let's take a look, first of all, at these two together. Both of them are going to discuss love in some respect. Phaedrus is going to praise love as this ancient god or force and as the source of our highest good. He's got this wonderful metaphor, or maybe better not a metaphor, but a proposal for an army of lovers as a very tough military force. That's not really that serious of a speech. Pausanias gets us to something a bit more serious in terms of proposals. He begins distinguishing between good and bad love. So he introduces a distinction within love itself, and he discusses the laws and customs of the Greek city-states pertaining to love, and he notes some inconsistencies there. So here's some of Phaedrus's key points, right? Love is the source of the human being's highest good, he says. And he says that there's no greater blessing than love. And it works both ways. To the developing man, the beloved youth, than a generous lover, you have this older person who takes you under their wing because they love you, they're attracted to you, they open up opportunities. And to the lover, then the beloved youth. So this is kind of a viewpoint that makes this private relation of erotic desire something that is the highest good. And notice the other things that Phaedrus contrasts us with. He says family or rank or privilege or wealth. These are good things, but they're not as good as love. And why not? Why are they not as good as love? They don't guide a person to what is actually best. What is best, according to Phaedrus, is the better life. And this is one that's focused on honor in the eyes of the lover. This is going to lead us to the notion that the love is going to bring out the best in us, not just personally, not just privately, but also politically. It could be used to keep us on the right track in society, in military operations. The reason why he says we should have these armies of lovers is because they're going to be afraid to look bad in each other's eyes. Pausanias is going to say, well, that's good, but we really need to make a distinction here. We need to be more realistic about love. Not all love is good. Not all love leads us to the better things. As a matter of fact, we can talk about two different Aphrodites, the goddess of sexual desire. There is a heavenly or Uranian love who is not the product of the sexual act, born from the heavens themselves, and this leads to love of the mind or the soul of the other person. Then there's what he calls pandemion, or earthly. This is the other Aphrodite who's the product of the sexual act between Zeus and Dione. So what he's doing is he's playing off of a tension within Greek mythology itself between the origin story of Aphrodite. And this earthly love leads to love of the body. The one of them is good, and the other one is actually, if not bad, at least kind of all over the map. It could turn out to be good, it could turn out to be bad, it's not predictable. So love of the mind is the good type of love. He also has this really interesting discussion of the legal systems in the Greek city-states that have to do with regulating relations of love between these older, fully mature men and younger men, or sometimes even boys. And he says there ought to be a law against loving mere boys. And it's not based on a notion of exploitation or something like that, the way it might be for us, when we talk about the age of consent. He says the reason why you shouldn't do this is because their character is not yet clear. They're underdeveloped, right? And, you don't want to throw away good time and resources on the potentially vicious lover. And then he talks about the differences between these different Greek peoples. And it's kind of a typical, the Athenians are right in the middle between the far too, under sort of refined but weak Ionian Greeks, and then those crude, rough Greeks in the north who, aren't very articulate. In the north, there's really no legal regime, and anybody does sort of what they want in terms. And so a lot of it is really not. It's driven by erotic desire, but it's not a consensual relationship. They rule it out altogether in Ionia because they're under Persian law, and the Persians don't like freedom and don't like all that sort of stuff. And Pausanias says the Athenians have it more or less just right. But there's an ambivalence there in Greek attitudes about male-male love. And he points this out with many examples. On the one hand, it's felt to be something good, but then again, fathers try to make sure that their sons aren't being brought into these sorts of relationships, so maybe it's not good. And the younger lover often gets made fun of by his peers. So it's clear that there's something on the one hand that they view as good, but on the other hand kind of shameful. And so Pausanias has a proposal here. He says the law ought to distinguish between the good and bad lovers. We ought to leave the good lovers alone, that is, those who are going to love the other person for their mind, they're going to cultivate them. It's not primarily about sexual attraction, or if there is something like that going on, it's in terms of attraction primarily through the personality. And then we ought to restrict the other, pandemic, the earthly lovers from consummating their relationships. So those give you some interesting political aspects to love. Then we have Aristophanes' speech, and I think it's worth mentioning here that many people attribute this to Plato as his own position. So they think that Plato himself is advocating what it is that he's putting in the mouth of Aristophanes. That's not actually the case. Aristophanes was a great comedic playwright, and he is telling a kind of silly story that's supposed to have a deep meaning here. So the mythological account, and I'm going to go through this very quickly, is that human beings were originally different than we are. Originally, what we perceive as an integral person, with two legs and two arms and one set of sexual organs and one head and all that sort of stuff, was just half of a human organism. Instead, we were these round creatures that had 4 arms and 4 legs, and we rolled all over the place, and we were very powerful. So we became a little bit too big for our britches, and tried to take over, and the gods said, we got to deal with this. So Zeus cuts all of these, he actually has Hephaestus do it. He has the human beings cut into halves. And this leads to all sorts of problems. It's supposed to be typical comedy stuff. It's supposed to be a solution to a problem, and it leads to other new problems because these halves go wandering around trying to find each other, and they don't really want to do anything. They start dying off, and the gods are like, who's going to worship us? Who's going to give us our sacrifices? So they fix it by straightening out the design, by moving the genitals around to the front. And this allows, as Aristophanes is going to say, this allows for reproduction. In the pairs where it was a male and a female together, they can, reproduce and continue the species. And in the case of, male-male or female-female, they can at least, get it on and then get on with real work now that they're no longer being driven mad by sexual desire. So, and the human condition for Aristophanes is that we are seeking the missing half of ourselves, or at least something sort of like it, because maybe the missing half died off. So if our missing half was somebody who was male, then we look for males. If it was somebody who was female, then we look for females. Interestingly, this sort of radically reverses the priority of what we nowadays call heterosexuality over homosexuality. We tend to look at heterosexuality in our society as if, that's, the heterosexuals are the males who are really male and they're attracted to females, and the female who are really female and therefore are attracted to males. And Aristophanes says, no, they were androgynous. Those pairings were originally, male and female together. And so he actually, frames them in quite unflattering ways. They tend to be adulterers and unfaithful wives. And again, remember, it's comedy here. And then there's, people whose original composite was two females, and those are female homosexuals who desire, other women. And similarly with male halves, they desire men. Here's where it gets particularly interesting in terms of politics. But, Aristophanes doesn't talk much about the female-female coupling, but he does talk quite a bit about the male-male one. And there's sort of a defense in there of their activities. He says the cause for their behavior is that they're actually hyper-masculine. They are more masculine than the men who seek out women. They're attracted to masculinity in their lover. They're attracted to these features in their lovers or their beloved. And he says that they show real manliness in public life, which means in the political sphere. That means that he thinks that these people are in some way better suited for politics than are, what we nowadays would call, say, heteronormative people, right? And so there's an interesting reversal going on here. He also notes, too, that there's no natural desire to marry and produce children on the part of these men, but they'll do that because of the custom of society so that, they can continue on with what it is that they're supposed to be doing. What are some of the other implications? So these are the people that he thinks are the ones attracted to and suited to political life. It could be in part, he doesn't tell us a lot about this, but it could be in part because, the people who are attracted to the opposite sex are going to form households and focus on the domestic sphere rather than on the public sphere. And what we want to think about is how desire plays out in this sort of arrangement, and whether the kind of old boys club that he seems to be on the verge of proposing would be a good or useful arrangement for political life. Should we have a class of people who are, so to speak, disengaged from their domestic life in order to realize this political, what we call it, management of society together as sort of a shared good, or do we want some other sort of relation? It seems like Aristophanes is actually proposing this as a public good. When we go to look at Diotima, who is, of course, the teacher of Socrates' speech, we get a very different kind of account. So Socrates tells us that he's not going to give a speech like everybody else, and this is typical Socrates, right? He's the guy who gets up in front of everybody and says, "Unaccustomed as I am to public speaking," and then, of course, gives a great public speech. So he tells us that he's going to talk to us about what he learned about love from his teacher when he was a young man. And his teacher is an older woman, Diotima, this priestess, this wise woman. And she provides Socrates with an initiation into the mysteries of love, but she does so in a rational way. And I'm not going to talk that much about all the ins and outs of this. We'll do that more in these longer, intensive seminars. But she does say that we have a desire for immortality, and love and sexual desire are really about producing something that will in some way be immortal. We don't realize this. We think it's about getting it on and getting off, but really it's about leaving something behind. And she talks about people being pregnant in the body. Here she has in mind men who are looking, because there was sort of a conception back then that the child is actually coming from the man through the seed that's being planted in the woman who then carries it. Obviously the biology is a bit off, but we can see what she's talking about metaphorically here. Those who are pregnant in the body, they want to have sex, which ultimately produces children. And they do this in part because whether they realize it or not, they want to leave these children behind as replacements. Animals do this, even plants do this. And the question that we should ask is whether this really gives you any sort of lasting immortality, or whether it's just sort of a fruitless desire that just reproduces others like us, and with it its own new desire. There's other types of immortality, she says. So here she discusses those who are pregnant in the soul or the mind. Now notice that she doesn't say they just go around and find some raw material and work with that. Instead, they find partners who can appreciate what they're doing. And she talks about the poets. And we have to think about people who produce great media products. She's talking about Hesiod and Homer and how they produce great works of poetry that stand the test of time. We're still reading Homer today. We're still, in much less, reading Hesiod. Some of us still do read Hesiod. And we're still reading many other great works of literature as well. So there's a kind of immortality that's attained through that, through the production. But she goes on, and here's where a political dimension enters in. She says that lawmakers and statesmen produce even better children, which are laws and societies and institutions. And she brings up Lycurgus and Solon, these great lawmakers, Solon for Athens, Lycurgus for Sparta, as prime examples of this. Then she also talks about this ladder of love. The idea in the Symposium is that at the very end, we can ascend through a kind of following out our erotic desires and purifying them in light of contemplation of what makes the things desirable, moving from the lower to the higher. And we start with single beautiful bodies. It's interesting that you can't skip that step. You have to be attracted to other bodies first. And we start to note what makes them beautiful. We start to notice commonalities. And then we start to move to the beautiful soul. In the end, it finishes with the beautiful itself, the form of the beautiful or the form of the good, which we're not really going to talk about here, because if you're contemplating that, you don't pay much attention to anything else. What's most important here is that the lower is dependent upon the higher, and so love of a lower beauty can lead us through to a higher beauty. So love of the beautiful soul leads us to the love of beautiful activities, customs, and laws. We say the beautiful soul is made beautiful through these, and so that's a higher love. We move from the personal to the impersonal. Love of these things, activities, customs, and laws, leads us to love of the knowledge that guides them and makes them possible. And for Plato, in each case, we're getting to know what is more real and more valuable. So we move from the, you might say, realm of private erotic desire to the public sphere that makes the individuals what they are, or at least opens up the possibilities for them. And then we move from that, where we're in the realm of politics itself, to the realm of knowledge. There's a movement from the practical, the active, to the contemplative. So are there implications for politics in this? Plato does think we're shaped by the kinds of political regimes we live and develop within. And the question that we should ask ourselves is whether our possibilities go beyond those of our society or whether we're just conditioned by it. And the answer for Plato is that we have to make an effort to go beyond those that our society is giving us. So the way in which we understand desire and love and relations to each other has some important implications. The other question is, does society need to be transformed or changed or protected? And if so, who is qualified to do that? And towards what ends? How does love or this transformation of erotic desire figure in here? Maybe not everybody, from Plato's perspective, ought to be calling the shots in politics or culture. Maybe it's just the people who have developed to a certain extent. But notice that this development is not just a cognitive development, but an affective development, a development of our desires, of the things that most fundamentally move us. This is, in a certain way, a very optimistic view that Plato is enunciating here about our capacities for making emotion and desire serve us in some way. So now we have plenty of time. I'm a little bit over time, but we'll take up some time with Q&A. You can, unmute your mic and ask me the question or make the comment that you want, or you can write it and I'll see it in the chat window and I will respond to it. All right. So Mark writes, one could argue the end of life is contemplation, and ordering one's actions towards this end mean one has the chance of fulfilling one's nature and thus being happy. So, yeah, I mean, I think that is Plato's take, that the highest happiness that we can enjoy is through contemplation, and it's contemplation of reality as it truly is, rather than how we often portray it to ourselves. So there's a cognitive transformation that goes on there, moving away from being directed to some things that are semi-real to things that are more real. It's always a bit difficult to say what is that going to look like. And Plato gives us some interesting metaphors about this, but doesn't ultimately tell us enough. I think that kind of makes sense given the nature of what he's describing. Now, for me, the more interesting question is it possible to enjoy genuine happiness here in this life, in our personal relationships, in our political or social, or I think for many of us, job engagements, without ascending all the way to this form of the beautiful? The earlier speakers seem to imply that it is, right? Pausanias and Phaedrus and Aristophanes. The question is whether Diotima thinks we can or not. And, I think the answer is actually yes. When she's talking about the immortality that Homer or Solon enjoys, Solon reordered his political community, and they actually gave him a lot of grief in doing so. The Athenians were riven by stasis or faction, and all of them were pretty much out for their own faction in doing so. But he reordered the Athenian constitution and produced a better, more sustainable society, at least for a certain point. And I think he could take great joy in that sort of thing, a kind of satisfaction and fulfillment. Now, I think Plato would probably say that in some way Solon was operating with, something like the knowledge of how to do that, and that contemplating that knowledge is something that we can be drawn to through erotic desire. But notice there has to be a kind of transformation taking place with all of this. So that's a good question. Let's take some other ones.
Michael Welch.
All right, so we're in the question answer period. Anybody have any burning questions, comments, talking points they want me to respond to?
Well, I have a short question.
Sure.
I wonder, how exactly does Plato envision this ladder happening, moving from the lower to the higher stage of love?
Yeah. So there's a couple components to it. I mean, he sketches it out in that speech that Diotima gives, and she first does it, sort of in long form, and then gives it kind of a summary form. So it definitely has this hierarchical structure to it, right?
Right.
Now the question is, how do we move from each stage to the next stage? And she says that we need some other person generally to be our companion on this, to help us with it. And I think she's, in that respect, that's probably right. There is the possibility of, that's discussed like in the Republic of, moving from one level of we might call it one level of lesser reality to another higher level of reality, and the similar thing is happening here. But even there's education taking place. So it is something that I suppose one could sort of discover on one's own, but usually there's some sort of initiator or guide along the way. She doesn't go into great detail about precisely how this is supposed to happen. It's more about what the progression is. And she does tell us that the lower is what it is because of the higher. So, we can think about, well, what makes a beautiful soul a beautiful soul? And we might have a lot of other answers for that than Diotima provides. She gives a political answer. It's the laws and institutions and the activities that people engage in, something that's bigger than them. And we might have other things that we think makes a soul a beautiful soul, or determines it as a beautiful soul. So it could be that we need a wider account if we're going to try to have this sort of account. But we don't get from Plato, what would actually be the practices, what would be like the handbook that would get us from one level to another.
All right, thanks.
Sure. Any other questions or comments or issues, confusions, rants? Plato got it completely wrong. Who is he to talk about this nonsense? I mean, I will say this. Well, I wait to see whether anyone else has anything to say. What's really cool about this particular dialogue is that it is so vivid. Each of the participants is a different kind of person, and they have a different mindset, and they respond to each other. So you're getting a kind of comparison and even conflict of different ideas presented against each other, and it's all brought to this great conclusion, this apex in Diotima's speech. And then, like any good thing, when you've got this super high tension and we're seeing the beautiful itself, at least in language, suddenly Alcibiades breaks in and everything goes crazy. And he gives his own speech about the nature of this Socrates guy at the end. And then by the end, if you haven't read the Symposium, you really want to. By the end, Plato is bringing us to a question that he himself grappled with in some of his other works, like the Republic, for example. Can the same person be a writer of comedy and tragedy at the same time? If we want to expand it a little bit more, can the same person encompass, to the greatest degree, separate approaches to reality? And the answer that some people think, Plato is not suggesting but embodying is yes. It is that Plato himself is the person who is able to encompass tragedy and comedy and medical discourses and legal discourses and this and that and weld them all together into some sort of composition. So Nietzsche actually, interestingly, thought that Plato was, in certain respect, a example of like pastiche, of putting together all of these different genres that have now, as he calls it, shipwrecked. And so Plato's kind of cobbling these things together. So it really depends on if you accept this sort of notion that there's a lot going on in Plato. Maybe he's the ultimate synthesizer of different genres, or maybe he's just a cobbler putting things together in that were essentially in broken form. We have another comment. Okay. Somebody, anonymous, asked, do I think Aristophanes' account is tragicomic? Well, there is a tragic aspect to it. It's primarily comic, in part because it's telling this crazy, silly story. But it is, in a certain sense, tragic because it does imply that for many of us, we may not be able to find our missing half. Right? It's a huge world. Missing halves can die. There's the whole issue of like, well, if we were cut in half a long time ago, how do we have missing halves now? But there could be some tragic aspects to it. Max writes, I'm not sure if this is a can of worms to be opening just now, but do you think there's some correlation between Aristophanes' notion of separated beings, however absurdly it was intended in Jung's concept of the anima and animus, the sort of male and female sides of things? And I mean, Jung is one of the sort of really underlying principles of Jung's work in general is that we need, when there's a duality, we need both sides of the duality, and the sides are in some way connected or attracted to or engaged with each other. And so a lot of Jungian analysis focuses on trying to work that out in particular. Is there a correlation between Aristophanes' notion of separated beings and what Jung is doing? I guess you could say there is, in a sense. Jungian analysis in part is trying to rediscover, to bring to light, to consciousness what it is that we lost sight of, but that's somehow still there for us, right? And it can be a matter of finding another person, who we're in relationship with, who we end up being compatible with. We respond to in certain ways. So yeah, I think there could be some connections. I mean, Jung certainly knew Plato. I mean, everybody who is everybody read the Symposium at one time or another, and it's part of the sort of common culture of educated people in his day. And that notion of looking for our separate half has been extremely influential. Like I said, some people mistakenly view it as that is Plato's theory of love, and they portray it that way, when really it's Diotima's discussion that gives us his theory of love. Not sure where Plato himself got it from. So, all right, are there any other questions or comments? We have a few. We're over time, but I started a bit late, so we can take a few more minutes if you like. Well, if there aren't any, then what I will end with is by saying that in my view, the Symposium is one of the greatest works of Western literature. And I focused in on just a few of the themes in the work, but it's well reading in its entirety and rereading and rereading. The person who I actually got to spend a semester reading it in Greek with himself had been reading it for 40 years. And when I asked him why he kept on doing it, he said that there were still questions open for him in that text. So it's of such richness that you can't really exhaust it the way most classic works are. So hopefully, if you haven't read it, this will provoke you to go and read it, and hopefully those of you who have read it already to reread it, and whatever you get from it, that's great. You will always be able to find yourself getting more on a rereading, as I have in preparing for this. So thanks all of you for your questions and participation, and I will sign off and wish you a good week.